So my goal is to communicate as plainly as possible to everybody so that they understand what's going on.
Nameer, how are you doing?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing just fine. We're in the throes of the campaign, and it's 72 hours, or as they say over here, 3 more sleeps until election night. So on the go.
Great, that's great. So, how are the things in Canada?
The big issue in Canada is really how we're going to get through the pandemic and what the post-pandemic world looks like. In many ways, it is the defining issue globally. And how we respond to this will determine how many people live or die, unfortunately.
You're running for the candidacy in Niagara West.
Yes.
So, how are the demographics there, the people there, and what do they want and expect from the upcoming election? And what are you offering to as a candidate?
The day-to-day campaign really revolves around family support. And family support includes $10 a day childcare because we don't necessarily have extended families living here together. And one of the things that's personal to me as an immigrant to Canada is, the path to citizenship for people who would spend a quarter of their life to a third of their life in Canada, but not be able to become Canadian citizens. Really different sets of issues that come together because the riding is so diverse.
The economies, well, that it's getting a little back onto track recently.
Yeah.
That due to the vaccinations, have you seen a gradual shift?
Be there, but remember the conversation at the beginning of the pandemic where they talked about, I don't know if you guys heard it, flattening the curve. So they understand that the disease may be there over the longer term, but you want to be able to limit its impact so that it doesn't overwhelm the health system or shut down the economy. And in Ontario, at least, we're at the stage where it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. We're going to go into what we call the lockdown, the full shutdown of the economy where people aren't allowed to go into non-essential businesses or get non-essential services in person. So I think we're on our way out of there. Not having to go into a lockdown is a positive step forward, and that is the outcome of the vaccination strategy. Anti-vax contingent who's there, and they are campaigning against vaccinations as an infringement of their personal rights. And that is something that is going to be the challenge because in terms of the people who are getting infected, over 90% of them right now are unvaccinated individuals or have single vaccination single vaccines. They haven't got the double shot yet. And that's the challenge, right? It's not vaccinated people who are driving the health crisis. It's unvaccinated people right now in Canada who are driving the health crisis. And this little, I would say, political offshoot, and they are very vocal, haven't helped the situation.
All right. Canada was one of the countries that was at the forefront of securing vaccines for the country as a whole. And it's estimated that Canada has around 5 times of what it needs to vaccinate its population with both the doses. So is the NDP looking to put forth any policies for for exporting vaccines?
It's an interesting question because what you're talking about really was the initial agreements made by the federal government with a variety of manufacturers prior to their products becoming approved. This was when they were in the testing stage. So numerically, it looked like we had 5 times or 6 times the number of vaccines. Trudeau would go ahead and try and sign a deal with a Chinese company, and then halfway through, the Chinese government intervened and said, no, you're not going to provide any vaccines to Canada. So Canada initially had a setback off the bat. In fact, we had some of the lowest vaccination rates off the bat. The Trudeau government, to make up for it, then dipped into the pool of vaccines that was really earmarked for developing countries, which I thought was inappropriate to do. Didn't make sense and were actually counterproductive, to our healthcare strategy and also to our foreign policy approach. So we've done well now, and I do believe that over the long term that, yes, Canada would, or we would be, the NDP would be engaged in, I don't want to call it vaccine diplomacy, but just do the right thing. If we've got extra stocks, let's send it out there because India and Bangladesh both have got a long way to go.
Since we've learned about the situation with regards to vaccinations and COVID in your constituency, I think another major component you were talking about was the environment.
Yep.
So can you elaborate about that, the policies that the NDP would adopt?
I'm going to do a little bit of a compare and contrast on that, in the sense that where Canada fits in the grand scheme of things, I think it used to be the top 10. I think it's probably in the top 15 right now. Canada produces about 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which doesn't sound like a lot, but considering how small Canada's population is in relation to the global population, it is a huge per capita impact. Almost 1% of that comes from one province alone, that's Alberta, and 40% of it, so about 25% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions come from the oil and gas sector alone. So we know where the biggest impact, what the biggest driver of climate change is. And to give you an idea of how big it is, the biggest climate change initiative that was held in Canada was the retirement of coal gas plants in Ontario. And it took the equivalent of millions of cars off the streets in terms of the greenhouse gas impact. But you'd never notice it in terms of the national output of greenhouse gases, because as soon as that happened, oil and gas production ramped up in Alberta, and it looked like there was our position hadn't changed. So the Trudeau government has doubled down on the oil and gas sector. They've bought an oil pipeline. They're in the process of building it right now. And on top of that, they've said that the oil and gas sector can continue to receive subsidies. I'm not even sure if they can receive subsidies, but they want the oil and gas sector to grow if they can. And what they're trying to do at the back end is legislate emissions. But environmentally, that's really the equivalent of saying you can smoke more cigarettes, we'll just make cancer illegal. And that's not how it works. If we're to go forward, so our approach is different. Our approach is we're going to take away subsidies from the oil and gas sector. There are government subsidies and tax breaks. That needs to go. We want to reinvest in the green economy. That's something that we've talked about considerably. Right. Step into things like the hydrogen economy, public mass transit, or zero emissions homes via our national building code. And then in terms of the oil and gas sector, which will have what's known in the economic space as the long tail. So it'll have a long tail, it'll have a long life, but we need to step away from that as we transition into the green economy.
We wanted to ask you that the current sitting MP is Dean Allison from Niagara West, if I'm not wrong. So how do you think Dean Allison has performed in both of these two main topics we've talked about? One is definitely working towards green energy, and one is about the pandemic.
So first of all, I like Dean. Dean and I will have conversations, and sometimes we disagree, and sometimes we agree, and whatever else. Dean's been there a long time. He's been there 17 years. It is a conservative riding, and he relies on a base of support that's there. In terms of the overall green energy on the environmental side, we know that the Conservative Party will roll back climate change targets, and we don't think that's appropriate. So Dean has his hands tied on that. On what the troubling bit on the pandemic side is that in terms of getting to the agreements that we needed to get to help the Canadian peoples, it was the NDP doing the negotiating, and it really wasn't the Conservatives who stayed out of the mix. And if they really wanted to be useful, they would have been a little more engaged in that space. The challenge that I hear from Dean every once in a while, and I've heard from other Conservatives, is that we helped prop up the Liberal government. And one of the things I said is that the pandemic happened 3 months after an election, and we're not going to throw the country into a political crisis as it's going into a healthcare crisis. That's not the appropriate thing to do. The thing to do is to do the right thing for the people and negotiate at the table based on what we think the right things are. So it looks like we're going into some kind of a minority government, but what that minority government looks like, I'm not sure.
So now that we've discussed at least what the local government is looking to do to counter both the issues or problems that you brought up, what are some of the central policies that have helped or maybe failed during the pandemic, and also to counter the environment crisis and green energy? And is there anything that you think would help your constituency or Canada as a whole?
We've had this issue with the Aboriginal peoples in Canada have been absolutely horribly treated for about 150 years. And the truth and reconciliation process with that hasn't gone well either. There's a lot of discord. There's a lot of unhappiness. You had a better chance of surviving the First World War as a soldier than you had of coming out of an Aboriginal school alive, statistically speaking, right? So we're beginning to grapple with that injustice right now. And one of the things that Trudeau's again done is he's taken Aboriginal survivors and residential school survivors to court to fight compensation and payouts, which we don't think is appropriate. This is something, if the government, and it has been responsible for what I would consider to be a horrific crime, they need to take ownership and they need to stop victimizing the victims again in court. So there are a lot of things that he's just not delivered on. He's a beautiful guy to look at, right? But when you dig past the looks, there ain't much there. And I really call him, sometimes people call him a rock star politician. I say he's a boy band politician because he's pretty like a boy band. But when you dig a little deeper, there ain't much there.
Being a person of color, how does being a minority influence your political stance?
Canada talks a really great game around being inclusive and having a diverse population and all of that. But when you get into it, there are structural barriers in place. There is latent racism. There is bias still, etc. And my approach to that has been to be that person of color and to be that voice of change and to be that representation and that representative for diversity door to door as I go campaigning. Niagara West isn't very diverse, but it was important for me to step up, not just this election, but the last election, and say, this is important for us as our part of our identity. And we need to get used to the idea of a person of color who's running, because I don't want to be viewed as a person of color who's running. I want to be viewed as, hey, there's Nameer, who just happens to be a person of color bringing a left of center agenda. I've met neo-Nazis. I've been refused service on the basis of color. I've had people tell me I don't belong in this country. I've had people tell me that this country wasn't made for people like me, right? And as long as those thoughts are there, as long as I continue encountering them, I am going to be at the forefront of pushing for change and saying that I'm going to make it as hard as possible to dismiss me as an immigrant, as hard as possible to dismiss me as a person of color. But when the Black Lives Matter issue happened here, one of the things I said on LinkedIn is that, putting up a banner or, putting up a little token on a profile is easy. The hard bit about change is that it means difficult conversations. And it is really difficult to call out racism. It's really difficult to call out sexism. It's really difficult to call out discrimination, especially in a power structure, especially if you're in a company, especially if it's your manager or your director who's doing that, right? And it means making yourself vulnerable to step up and do the right thing. And that is always a challenge. But the people who do that, who find the courage to do that, and find the courage to do that smartly, not be rage out and be angry, but be smart about it, right? And to engage, they're the people who make change. So I'm not going to say that my approach is appropriate for everybody, but I think everybody has a role to play in that in terms of how they bring about change. And I think you guys are on the right path, at least in terms of having those conversations.
You raise a very good point, and I think in multiple leftist spaces we have this discourse. It's about performative activism and real activism.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Just on that, out of curiosity, and since we need to appeal to the Zoomers, what do you think about AOC's appearance with that tax the rich dress? Do you think that was something which falls in that performative activism category, or do you think that will bring any substantive change?
Here's the thing about AOC. She's allowed to be performative because she's substantive too, right? So if it was performative, and it was performative, that's great. But the thing about AOC is she puts her money where her mouth is, and she goes out and she does what she has to do, and she campaigns as she has to campaign, and she puts forward legislation as she puts forward legislation, and she's within the structure, she's doing her bit. So if after that she does something performative like it was at that event recently, I'm like, go for it. What irks me is when people don't do anything but the performative and then don't do anything substantive. And I would much rather have the substantive rather than the performative, but the performative is easier. there's nothing online at really at stake for you in the performative space. But my challenge, and this is a critique of the left, and this is coming out from somebody who's worked in a conservative province and runs in a conservative riding, is that the left tends to lecture everybody else. And I don't think that's appropriate. They tend to talk down to people and talk at people. But my approach at the door is, if you don't like me, that's fine. You sound off. But after you're done, we're going to have a conversation, and we're going to have a conversation about the things that we disagree on. Most importantly, we're going to have a conversation about the things that we agree on. And then in that space, we're going to find a path forward that's better for everybody, including the country. I was in an interview 2 or 3 days ago on Facebook, and there was this whole question around activism online. And my approach has been that I think, online is just a tool. You've got right-wingers and you've got people with a lot of extreme bias and hate who are using online to disseminate and propagate negative messages. And then you've got, left-wingers who are online too doing the same thing. But the fact of the matter is that if we continue just to focus just on the online space and not build up capacity to take the message to the door, and this is what we call, what I really like is Stacey Abrams in the States, right? What her approach was to build up that capacity to bring up that message to an individual at the door, and that's how you move populations along. Right now, people are subjected and bombarded to snippets of conversation. We've got algorithms that bias or torque that approach, algorithms that torque negative messaging, and Facebook doesn't want to get out of that space because, let's face it, this is how they make money, right? If it makes money for them to connect right-wingers or people who spread anti whatever propaganda, that's what their algorithms are designed to do. But I think too many people put stock in the online community or the online approach because that's so visible. And not enough people talk about building capacity to deliver that message on the ground where you can have that human connection. And that is tougher to do, right? And that's a part of our perpetual struggle within the riding, is to build up that capacity, that group of people who can go out and then take that message to the door and have conversations and cut through that bias just a little bit. What we've talked about, and it's not necessarily the class war, though people on the left are talking about, in class terms, but my approach has been equitable society and based on progressive values. And sometimes I have to connect threads of what equitable means, and what we're doing isn't crazy. We're not going to go out and break the country. What we want to do is rebalance the country a little bit for the benefit of everybody. And when you start having those conversations, door by door, people go, oh, they didn't put the pieces together as to what that looks like and how that could be and how a left of center government could do that, because we get caught in this loop of, from the right, we get caught on the tax and spend side of it. We're going to tax businesses into the ground and burn down the country economically. On the center side, the liberals say, oh, if you vote for the NDP, the conservatives will sneak in, right? And then here I am trying to say, no, that's not true. First of all, you should vote for whoever you want, and that way you get the country that you want, number one. And number two is that this whole tax and burn approach is not what you think it is, and I have to unpack that a little bit more. So the thing that we've latched onto is a 1% additional tax on people who have over net assets in excess of $10 million. And we know that can potentially bring in something like $60 billion more. And the question I ask people is, do you think 1% more on somebody who has $10 million is going to bankrupt them? And the obvious answer to that is no. They wouldn't even feel it. Right, their bank account may be a little smaller, right, coming out of that, but in terms of quality of life, impact, etc., would they be able to continue being the ultra rich? They'll continue being the ultra rich, but what that means is that 1% could be redistributed to help struggling families, struggling businesses, rebuild the economy, invest in our growth, invest in our future. And I put it like that: we're investing in our country, and we're investing in our people, and we're investing in our future.
You know how the average citizen, or I'm talking about apolitical people to be very specific, you know how they don't really engage in such political matters. They don't really care about what a political party has to say. Like, I'm sure you understand what I'm saying. So what do you think makes NDP different from other parties who might want to spread their word, or how do you aim to get your propaganda across to the general public?
Well, I will say, first of all, I will disagree with the word propaganda. We do
Yes,
have,
I have a
we
very
do,
limited
no, that's
vocabulary.
okay, that's okay. But we have policy positions, and it's always a struggle because we are smaller, and we are left of center, and we don't necessarily have as much money. So the struggle always is communicating that out. Social media is a chunk of it, but it doesn't get the what I found more effective, and I said this before, on the ground capacity and having those conversations door by door. Because on online you get snippets of it. In the news you might get snippets of it. Then you've got a lot of alternative messaging against our platform, etc. And the best way forward for me has always been, let's have those conversations and let's start pushing. Let's figure out what we disagree on. Let's figure out what we agree on, and let's push forward from there. Because if you agree with our policy and you like what our policy is, and if you've seen that the other political parties haven't agreed, haven't done it, or don't want to do things like this, then it's worthwhile voting for the NDP. But it requires a little bit of that courage, because I think the average individual does what they call strategic voting in their head right off the bat. And I need to cut through that. And I need to say that if you want an honest government, you got to vote honestly. Don't vote out of fear, vote out of the future that you want. And if you like the future that we're presenting, you've got to vote for it. And that requires a little bit of strength, and that requires a little bit of courage.
That's great, Nameer. Yeah. So just a quick question to wrap up the entire interview. I just wanted to ask, both as a citizen of the world and like as a normal teenager, how can we have the tough conversations and promote that bit of substantive activism?
You have those tough conversations just by having those tough conversations. You see something wrong, and then you're going to say, hang on, that wasn't right. And why wasn't it right? Well, here are my reasons. And then you need to understand the other side. Why did you do that? And the person might say, I did that because of these reasons. I said, okay, all right. So maybe instead of doing that, we could do this instead. And sometimes something is just wrong, and you've got to call it for what it is, wrong. And you've got to have the space and the courage to call it for what it is, wrong. And understand that not everybody's going to agree with you, and you need to be able to take the criticism and the backlash that comes with it. And that's the tough bit, right? That's where the metal comes in. But my approach always has been, be smart in terms of having your conversation. The path to that better future is always figuring out how you can get the people who disagree with you to agree with you, right? And for that to happen, you have to understand their point of view. And there is some things that you're just not ever going to agree with, but there are other things that you can pull them along with. And maybe that's the space that you get into. I'm not going to say that my path is right for you or for anybody. This is my personal approach. I'm going to say that you're going to have to find your own spaces, and you have to fight on your own issues. And you can't fight all the battles and win all the battles. You got to fight smart. And it might help to just choose one or two issues with which you're going to move that needle forward, right? There is no end of injustice in the world, and you shouldn't be responsible for solving all of it, but you can solve maybe a tiny sliver of it or get things moving. And civic society is not a sprint, it's a marathon. You're in it for the long haul, and look at it from the long haul, and look at it in terms of that longer term engagement. And the thing about difficult conversations, they're difficult. People don't want to have them because it requires emotional strength. So you got to build up your reserves over there. And the final thing is, not everything is a fight. Sometimes, yeah, you're in it for a fight, and sometimes you're not. Sometimes it's the discourse. So I think 80% of the time it's the discourse, 20% of the time it's the fight. And just know how to differentiate between each other, and never forget to listen.
All right, that was great, Nameer. Adi, you can take over.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving giving us your time and the little. This was a great interview. We hope you work for the elections. You've been doing a great job. We've been seeing it on your Instagram profile and all. That concludes the interview.
It was, first of all, let me just say thank you to you and your entire team for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. I wish you all the best in the future. If you're in Canada, give me a shout and come out to the Niagara region. And I was also going to say that we'll see how this election goes. There's a lot in the air, but I appreciate the chance to have this conversation.